Make it TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
You're listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project with your host, Rob Skiba.
All I'm offering is the truth.
Hello and welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba. And tonight, if we can get this off and running here, I'm supposed to be talking with author Douglas Elwell. He wrote a really amazing book called Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age. Planet X at the Creation, Nativity, and Second Coming. And I had him online here just a second ago, and I'm not sure if he can hear me now. Okay, cool. It says he can hear me. Very good. Looks like we're up and running. Nothing like technical difficulties in the last 10 seconds before the show comes on. All right. Doug is a publisher of Mysterious World at mysteriousworld.com, an online journal dedicated to travel, history, and ancient mysteries of the world. Doug has master's degrees in biblical and ancient Near Eastern studies and marketing communications from Wheaton College Graduate School, and voluminous amounts of experience in researching and writing on religion, history, mythology, and travel. His first book, Mysterious World, Ireland, received critical acclaim. And I have to say, the book that I just mentioned a minute ago, Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man, I picked up this book, oh gosh, it had to be probably mid-2012 as I was wrapping up my research for my second book, Archon Invasion, The Rise, Fall, and Return of the Nephilim. And of course I was studying the giants and everything for that book, and that doing Google searches and all kinds of research that I was doing for that book, I stumbled across the website, mysteriousworld.com, where Doug had a whole lot of really cool articles on giants there. And so that really intrigued me, and I contacted him and had him on the Revolutionary Radio Project before when I was over on Blog Talk, but now we are here on the Truth Frequency Radio, so it is my honor and privilege to bring back Doug Elwell to the Revolutionary Radio Project. Doug, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me back on.
Awesome. I was a little nervous there. I was like, oh no, just on, and all of a sudden everything disconnected, but this is not your first time here on the Revolutionary Radio Project, but it is the first time for me having you here on Truth Frequency Radio Network. Mm-hmm. So for the sake of my new audience here, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Okay. As I'm a professional web developer by day, but I do travel, history and ancient mysteries research by night. As a Christian, I tend to focus more on ancient Near Eastern and biblical studies. I have since I was a kid. I've always been interested in ancient Egypt, the ancient world, the world of the Bible, the old stuff you might see in the old Ten Commandments movie. I always found that fascinating. I've always been strongly drawn to the Old Testament and the mysteries of the Old Testament, of which there are many. And I'm focusing, the greatest of the mysteries is actually Planet X, which played a critical role not only in the beginning, in the creation, but it will also play a critical role in the end times. I also like studying the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. And in the process, I've discovered some other secrets which may prove critical to a complete understanding of the end times.
Mm. Excellent. Now, this is what I'm about to ask you is somewhat of a controversial topic. At least I'm finding it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the issue of the so-called gap theory between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, of all the arguments that I've heard on both sides, and I've heard a lot of them, yours was the most convincing to me, in leaning towards the gap theory idea. What is your view on that particular subject?
Well, mine, I don't hold to the gap theory specifically, but more to the idea of an ancient universe, and also that the description of the creation in Genesis 1 is not the creation of the earth, but the modification or recreation of the earth from a previous object that was in our solar system, that once orbited in the position where the asteroid belt is now, and was moved into its current position by a catastrophic conflict with another planet which entered into our solar system at a highly elliptical orbit, which is similar to that of a comet. In fact, comets have elliptical orbits because they were created as a result of this conflict and reflect the orbital path of the Creator object, which originally had, with not one but two of its satellites actually had collided with Earth. One of its satellites, a rocky satellite, shattered Earth and spread it out in such a way that remnants of the Earth were spread out in a circle around its original orbital path, which is now known as the asteroid belt. The majority of the material remained in what we now know as the Earth. Another large chunk coalesced and formed into Earth orbit as the Moon. So this is actually known in science as the giant impact theory. So I combined the two existing mainstream theories, the Planet X theory and the giant impact theory, and said one catastrophic conflict with this object and Earth, the Planet X and Earth, resulted in the creation of the asteroid belt, the Moon, the comets, Earth being moved to its current orbit closer to the Sun, where it's sufficiently warm to sustain life. Also, the Earth's rotational rate, relatively rapid rotational rate, axial tilt, the creation of the seas and oceans and atmosphere, and a number of other features which are unique to Earth, which only could have been created as a result of a catastrophic conflict between Earth and another large heavenly body.
So essentially, then you look at our current Earth that we are on right now in accordance with the biblical account of, say, 6,000-ish years ago, getting sort of a remake?
Yeah, the 6,000-year model could be thrown out, I believe. I think it's we're still actually operating under King James era scientific understanding. It was interesting. I think it was it Kepler or Galileo, whose idea was that the Earth was actually rotated around the Sun, and the guy who came up with that idea was actually under house arrest while the King James version was being published. Back then, the belief that the Earth rotated around the Sun was enough to get you killed. That's the kind of scientific level of understanding we have that was behind the interpretation of the King James creation material. King James concept and assumption, basis of assumptions that remain to this day in every single translation. No one ever bothered to reformat or relook at the creation material in the light of much more information now, except for me. I'm the only person who's really done any kind of significant work in that area, and that's what the book Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man, and End of the Age is largely about, is understanding what actually happened in creation and how similar events will happen again in the end times.
Now, you just touched on something that has piqued my interest recently, and that is the difference between the heliocentric model and the terracentric model. Have you done a lot of research on, obviously everybody that went to public schools, I mean, we're all taught the heliocentric model. What's your take on the opposing view?
I think if someone's still holding on to a Earth-centric model, are you talking about an Earth-centric model of the universe or of our solar system?
Oh, the solar system. That because you can look at books like the Book of Enoch and some of the others that would seem to indicate that it is the sun that's actually moving.
Yeah.
And so in cases like where Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, like if the normal paradigm that we are all taught in school is true,
yes,
and if my understanding of physics is correct, then for Joshua to command the sun to stand still, that meant the earth stopped rotating.
Right.
But that would be a different paradigm if the terracentric model was true.
Well, the terracentric model is not true. That's been proven, and those who still hold to that And forgive me if you hold to this, but they are either misinformed, delusional, or mentally ill. Because that's absurd. I mean, it's been proven absolutely it's true. There's no question about it. And my approach is that science is true, good science, actual real science based on facts and not opinions. Like, for example, evolution is about as faith-based as Christianity is, creationism is. There's no evidence for evolution. But real science is actually just about facts. Now, if the scientists beyond evolution actually use facts, they would understand there was no evidence for evolution, and the very idea of evolution is absurd. Similarly, we need to use facts in order to, as a reference point from which we can translate the Bible. We cannot just decide arbitrarily because I personally think the sky is more of a greenish color. I don't, but say, for example, I believe that. I believe the sky is blue, but the Bible says the word for blue could be translated as green. It is therefore green. That's not right. It's obviously blue. We know it's blue. It's been proven blue. We can go out into the outside and see it's blue. So we need to understand that a word that could be translated either, say, green or blue is obviously going to be blue because we can verify that empirically by looking at the sky ourselves. So in similar fashion, more complicated things like the motion of the earth around the sun, how the planets and the stars move relative to Earth and so forth. That can be verified. There's no question about it. If you still think the Earth is at the center of our solar system, it means that you simply are just uneducated or delusional. It's one or the other.
Yeah. Of course, I still hold to we're going around the sun routine. But what do you make of some of these ancient texts such as Enoch, what are they saying? Is it allegorical, or should we just throw it out as nonsensical, or is there another way we should look at it, or what's your take on it?
I would say, for example, I think it's Psalm 19, where it talks about the sun running a race in heavens, like a racer. And obviously, just because the sun is moving in the heavens or seen as being moving in the heavens relative to Earth, that doesn't mean that it is moving. It's our perspective. It's our perspective, yeah. The Earth is moving around the sun, and also the Earth is rotating, so it looks like the sun is moving, but it's not. It's based on perspective. So just by actually testing it now, that's not the case. Therefore, we can say it's either metaphorical. It's just metaphorical, or people didn't understand at the time, or they didn't understand that was true, and that was a common knowledge, and trying to explain people in elaborate detail that the Earth actually rotates around the sun would have been off topic and confusing to the reader. They just wanted to see that they were just describing the relative motion of the sun. So I don't think we should be interpreting reality based on Scripture. We should be interpreting Scripture based on reality. So, and I've said it many times in my own presentations, I'm like, when Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, then the Earth physically stopped rotating for that time period, if we accept that story to be true. There's another way of understanding that.
Okay.
There is the Earth's crust actually rotates on a highly lubricious or slippery layer known as the Mohorovicic discontinuity, also known as the Moho for short. And when the Earth's crust is actually just barely hanging on to the mantle, because this layer between the crust and the mantle is extremely slippery, very little friction in between those two layers. So if the Earth were hit at a different angle by, say, a large asteroid or a large body passed near enough to affect Earth's crust gravitationally, the crust could temporarily dislodge from the mantle and move either slow down or possibly move backwards for a period of time. So from the position of the observer on the Earth, it would appear that the sun actually stops moving in the sky, whereas it's just the crustal movement which is slowed or stopped or possibly reversed relative to the mantle which keeps turning underneath it. Think of an orange skin over an orange. If the orange skin and the orange became dislodged, they would have independent motion. So it is with the Earth. In fact, many scientists believe that the variations in the magnetic fields in various parts of the Earth are due to crustal displacements of this kind, possibly caused by large-scale bombardment of the Earth by asteroids, which would impart angular momentum into the crust, dislodging it temporarily and slowing it down, stopping or even reversing its motion relative to the mantle, And so to the observer on the surface, it would appear that the sun and moon changed places, whereas they were actually in the same place. It was the crust that was moving in an unusual way.
Fascinating. That's exactly where I was hoping you would take it.
Yeah.
So then it's reasonable to assume that possibly the Earth, something affected the Earth. The miraculous part of Joshua's deal would be the timing of the event, but that our God is a God of order who works within his own laws. And
right.
So, whether foreknowledge or what have you, when Joshua made his commandment for the sun to stand still, theoretically then on the other side of the planet, in a way that wouldn't have directly impacted him, something happened to cause the Earth to do that.
Probably one or more asteroids striking the Earth. In fact, during that time, God actually killed an army of the Amalekites using stones from heaven, indicating they were possibly moving through an asteroid belt or asteroid field of some kind of significance. During the time of Joshua, an army of the Amalekites was destroyed by what sounds like large meteorites. So there appears to have been a large amount of activity around that time of asteroidal and meteoric activity, and really an asteroid, just a large meteor. They're both basically just the same object at different sizes. So we probably have larger impacts around the Earth, affecting the rotation of the Earth's crust, slowing it down sufficiently in this case to make the day longer, and so they could defeat the armies of the giants in Canaan, have enough light to do that. God provided that extra time and also finished them off with his own barrage of asteroids.
Yeah. So in similar fashion, Immanuel Velikovsky put forth ideas that similar type of events could have been responsible for the activity of the Exodus.
I think that
he talked about Venus, though, I think, didn't he?
Yeah, Velikovsky I don't hold to at all. He's just more of an imaginative, interesting read. It's more like science fiction than real science. But Velikovsky is generally right in the sense that the ancients did worship the planets, and that events that happened in heaven were reflected in the mythology of people on Earth. Now, whereas he believed that Venus actually emerged from Jupiter, literally, and that explains why the goddess Venus is described as having emerged from the forehead of the god Jupiter in Greek and Roman myth. He took that literally, saying the planet Venus actually came out of the planet Jupiter, which is impossible. Its orbit would be far more elliptical than it is now, if that were true. So that's not the case. But generally speaking, he's interesting to read. I actually read him when I was in probably high school, just out of curiosity. I didn't really take on to him much. But that kind of concept that the gods in the ancient world, the gods were worshipped as planets, was correct. And I actually get into that in chapter 2 of my book, and understanding how the ancient Sumerians believed that Earth was created as a result of a conflict between their high god Marduk and a dragon goddess named Tiamat, who represented the Earth, and a conflict between this planet in heaven and Earth resulted in the recreation of the Earth as we now know it, and that's really the basis of ancient Near Eastern creation thought, and is ably reflected in numerous places throughout the Bible, including the Psalms, particularly the Book of Job, and even in Genesis, if you're able to see it there in the original Hebrew text.
Yeah, if I remember right now, what led me to your book, I was actually reading Myths from Mesopotamia by Stephanie Daly, Oxford Press, and I was reading all the Sumerian creation epics and all that stuff. And it was sometime around the time I was reading that I found out about your book, and I don't remember exactly what led me to it, but I have your book now in front of me here, and I have highlighted and annotated about the first 100 pages pretty extensively. And that's where I sort of left off because I went off into finishing my book. But I do remember, let me see if I can find it. Was it Isaiah 26 or something? You had a passage in Isaiah that you likened unto the issue with that conflict.
Let's see. Is it Isaiah 26? I think
I just found it. I have page 57. You're talking about Isaiah 26, 20 through 27:1.
What's the page number?
Page 57.
87? Okay, let's take a look at it.
God's conflict with the dragon?
Isaiah 26:20 to 27:1. Oh yeah, that is the Leviathan passage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where you were, and there was someplace else you were talking about, Bible makes mention of Rahab, and you liken Rahab to Tiamat and Tiamat to Leviathan, and forgive me, I forget the references, but it talks about that God did not create the earth without form and void, and yet we see in Genesis that the earth is without form and void.
Now, my theory about without form and void is it's actually tohu bohu, as you probably know. Now, the name for the ancient dragon goddess in Enuma Elish was actually Tiamat, and that was actually a personalization of the word Tihom. And the word for her companion in the book of Job is in the Babylonian text it's Kingu, but in the book of Job it's the pairing of dragon goddess and sort of this male counterpart, which is like an earth god, an earth beast, if you will, like the pairing in Revelation of the beast out of the earth and the beast out of the sea, which reappears in the end times again. There's this pairing of it like a dragon from the sea and a beast from the earth. That happened actually originally in the beginning too. Both in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, there's the dragon goddess Tiamat gives birth to this earth beast which she names Kingu, and places at the head of her heavenly army. Also in the book of Job we see the dragon goddess named Leviathan, and the earth beast named Behemoth. Now my theory is that Tohu Wabohu is actually short for Tiamat and Behemoth. And Tiamat represents the earth, and Behemoth actually represents the moon. So what they're saying here is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. They're saying, in the beginning, God created the asteroid belt in the earth. And then he says in verse 2, and the earth was earth and moon. So he divided, there's two divisions here. When he struck it first, the asteroid belt was created and the earth was moved to a different place closer to the sun. And then the moon was also created as a result of this giant impact. There's believed that the giant impact theory in modern science, which is a real and dominant theory of how the moon was created now in mainstream science. They believe that a Mars-sized object, not Mars itself, but an object roughly the size of Mars, collided with Earth at an angle, dug itself deep into Earth's mantle and core, and where it is to this day, actually. And as a result, a large amount of the mantle was jetted out, liquefied and jetted out into orbit around Earth. Over time, this cooled and solidified into what we now know as the moon. So this impactor not only created the asteroid belt, but it also created the moon. And that's what Moses is saying in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. He says, God created the asteroid belt on the earth, and then he created the moon from the earth as well. So there's two divisions. Like he created heaven, asteroid belt, and earth, and then he created earth and moon. That's what Tohu Wabohu is, earth and moon.
So then what do you say is being created in day 4, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night?
For a period of time, the lesser day, the lightness and the darkness is referring to Earth's rotational rate. Because originally, it's without a rotation, you don't have night and day. So there's a division between night and day because of the rotation rate. So you have a 24-hour day and a 24-hour night. So this is also saying not only was the asteroid belt created, the moon was created, the Earth rotation was imparted to it as a result of this strike from this large object. A lot of this momentum resolved itself in the form of a rotation of the Earth. If you look at the planets Venus and Mercury, they have little or no rotation rate, which is how you would see a planet would normally form. And when they ran models on how planets form out of nebula, they just kind of form out of this large nebula disk that's created when the infalling gas falls in on itself, beginning to form a sun. It's causing a rotation as this gas falls in on itself, and this rotation causes the nebula disk to spread out, and we can see this in formation in other star systems. So we know for sure this is how it works. And out of that nebula disk form the planets. Now, according to the scientific models, these planets should have little or no rotation rates. They should either rotate slowly forwards or slowly backwards. Venus is like that. It has a very slow rotation rate. I think it also rotates backwards relative to Earth. And Mercury is also very slow. I think Venus rotates 5 times a year as opposed to Earth's 365. So when you have a rapid rotation rate, that's unusual. So it must have been caused by some sort of outside force. My theory is that it was part of this process. Earth's rotation rate was created. And as a result, day and night were created, and the relative positioning of the moon and the sun near, relative to Earth with this new rapid rotation rate. They have the rising and setting of the sun at certain times, and that's what he's talking about here. That was also formed at the same time.
So if I understand what you're saying, on the day 4 event, it was due to the Earth spinning back up again.
Well, it hadn't been spinning to begin with. It was given a rotation rate. It was maybe a few times a year relative to now, like Venus. I think Venus rotates 3 to 5 times per year relative to Earth rotating 365 times a year. It was basically sped up because it was necessary to have more even distribution of light on the surface. Otherwise, one side would become extremely hot and the other side extremely cold. It's saying here that God then gave it a rotation, a relatively rapid rotation, dividing the light from the darkness. And so there was an evening and a morning. And as a result of this rotation, that was regular and much more rapid.
Interesting. Okay, we're just about ready to go to our first break. So when we come back from the break, I want to just dive right in and start talking about Planet X. Who or what is Planet X? We'll talk about that when we come back from the break.
We'll all get up. It'll be anarchy. Anarchy!
Live Free FM with Nathan Frazier.
Sundays on True Frequency Radio.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and tonight we're talking with Douglas Elwell about his book, Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age. Before the break, we were talking about the various creation accounts, the idea of a gap theory, and things of that nature, and I was just, during the break, looking through your book, and on page 54 through 58, you're describing some of the scriptures that you feel reference the divine conflict. You have echoes of the divine conflict in the Psalms listed here in Psalm 74, 12 through 17. For God is my King of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters. Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting wilderness. Thou didst cleave the fountain and the flood. Thou driest up mighty rivers. The day is thine and the night is thine. Thou hast prepared the light and the sun. Thou hast set all the borders of the earth. Thou hast made summer and winter. In Isaiah 51, 9 through 10 and 13 and 15, you quote, Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Art thou not it that hath cut Rahab and wounded the dragon? Art thou not it which hath dried the sea, the waters of the deep sea, that hath made the depths of the sea a way for the ransom to pass over? And forgettest the Lord thy Maker, that hath stretched forth the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth, and hath feared continually every day because of the fury of the oppressor, as if he were ready to destroy? And where is the fury of the oppressor? But I am the Lord thy God, that divided the sea, whose waves roared. The Lord of hosts is his name. And you said next to Psalm 74, Isaiah 51 has the most explicit reference to the divine conflict creation motif. Is that what led you to first seek out Planet X, or what was it that led you to first look into that whole idea?
Well, I was actually looking for signs of Jesus' second coming. Because I was convinced that he was going to come back in my lifetime. The Holy Spirit witnessed that to me. And so I looked in the scriptures to see what signs would, precede his second coming as part of my general study of apocalyptic. And I came across the passage in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talked about the signs of his second coming. So I say, okay, the disciples asked, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus goes into this prolonged speech, more generally known as the Olivet Discourse, where he says, basically at the height of a series of events that sound like the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, he says in Matthew 24:29, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So you have this great and heavenly sign, which, happens right at the trumpet. They talk about a great sound of a trumpet in verse 31 following. So at the peak of the tribulation period, at the seventh trumpet, it appears that there will be some great heavenly sign will suddenly appear, which will precede or be concurrent with the resurrection of believers. So I saw that that sounded like the most obvious sign that I could think of, a great heavenly sign in heaven. And in fact, Jesus was himself preceded by a star, the Star of Bethlehem, which preceded his first coming. So Jesus had a heavenly sign that preceded his first coming and apparently his second coming, according to Matthew 24:30. So I figured, well, maybe this heavenly sign is the same as or something similar to the Star of Bethlehem. So I started looking at the literature regarding what was the Star of Bethlehem, and did a fairly thorough analysis. But it basically boiled down to three different major theories. It was either a comet, a supernova, or a conjunction of planets. I looked at the comet theory and said, well, that's interesting, but comets are relatively common. You see several comets every century. And moreover, comets don't last long enough for the Magi to follow them all the way from Persia, which would probably be at least a month. And also, they're also harbingers of bad events, evil things, not good, harbingers of disaster. So it would have been totally inappropriate for the birth of the Son of God to be preceded by a comet. So I decided that didn't fit either practically or religiously. The supernova thing. Also, there were supernovae around that time, but supernova was only really bright for a couple of days, and once again, it didn't fit the time frame which the Magi would have needed to follow the star all the way from Persia. Moreover, novas are stars and move relative to the background stars, whereas this object was said to go before the Magi, indicating that it had an independent movement, independent of the background stars, meaning that it was an object that was relatively close to Earth, explaining why it could move independent of the background stars. So it wasn't a supernova either. And I looked at conjunction of planets, and I think the most popular theory was a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter, or a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. This happens once every 500 years or so. It's just moderately rare. But I myself witnessed such a conjunction, recently, relatively speaking. And the two planets only passed near each other for a day or two. It wasn't particularly spectacular, and it wasn't even a unique event. So this didn't really fit the criteria of the Star of Bethlehem either, notwithstanding the very idea of using astrology as presaging the birth of the Son of Man is totally inappropriate, because astrology is an occult science. So why Christians could embrace such a thing is anyone's guess. So I rejected the three main theories because it simply didn't work. And so I was kind of stuck. I said, well, either it's some kind of supernatural event, or it's a physical event of nature which we don't understand. And so as I was wrapping up my search, I came across an unusual book called The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin. And even though I found his theories fairly outlandish, and just a clarification, I am not a Sitchinite at all, I found his idea about Planet X being remembered in the Sumerian creation texts as colliding or coming, in conflicting with Earth in ancient times, and creating Earth in its present form. To be intriguing. If such a planet did exist, it would answer all the questions. It would certainly be both the Star of Bethlehem and the sign of the Son of Man. It would fulfill the criteria if the object were the same object for Star of Bethlehem and for the sign of the Son of Man. It would have to be a planet because it would have to be able to rotate in a circle and come back occasionally. So, and I wasn't sure about Sitchin's interpretation, so I checked it out in the mainstream scientific literature. Is this a legitimate theory? Does it have any, real basis in fact? And in fact, it does. And in fact, scientists have been searching for it for over 130 years now, to the point where they're convinced it's somewhere south of the ecliptic. It actually they believe it has an elliptical orbit, which brings it in and out of our solar system similar to that of a long period comet. And an orbit is actually at an angle to the ecliptic. So sometimes it's beneath the ecliptic and other times it's above. So it's difficult to find. It's dark. It's a dark object. It's very far away, and it has an extremely large orbit, so it's almost impossible to see until it's right on you, which would, of course, match the idea of the sign of the Son of Man at the end of the age being like a thief in the night, appearing suddenly in heaven. It has suddenly made perfect sense what Jesus was talking about. So when I understood this was the only thing that could have worked, and it in fact worked perfectly, explaining not only many of the anomalies of the creation, but also the end times, and of course the Star of Bethlehem, which happened in between. It all falls into place. And so I decided there was enough material to write a book that I feel is a definitive work on the subject.
Well, it's a big book. It's over 400 pages, so you put a lot into it. Of course, you're probably aware of Dr. Michael Heiser's website. I think Sitchin was wrong.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm not a Sitchinite, so.
Yeah.
But I didn't use Sitchin as a primary reference, even though I did talk about in chapter 4, his interpretation of Enuma Elish, and went through it so people could understand what he was talking about and how the Sumerians may have had at least a partial understanding of the original creation events memorized in their religious liturgy. Enuma Elish was actually highly influential in the ancient Near East. In fact, we see influences of Enuma Elish all over the ancient Near East, and I talk about that in chapter 1. The idea of the creation of the earth being related to God's conflict with a dragon. This motif shows up in Psalm 74, Job 9, and a number of other places which you cited throughout the Old Testament. And it even shows up in the book of Genesis in the word Tihom, the deep. When it says the Spirit hovered over the deep face of the waters, that is actually the word Tihom, which is cognate to the Akkadian Babylonian word Tiamat. Tihom and Tiamat are the same word. The only difference is the ending AT causes a personalization, so that the deep sea is not seen as simply a dead physical object, but is actually the personalization of a spirit. That's the main difference between the Hebrew take on the battle between God and the dragon and the Babylonian and Sumerian version. Is the Babylonians and Sumerians believed these were actual deities, whereas the biblical text, which is actually in many ways the very first true scientific text, says these are not deities, they are simply objects which God created and were performed to perform a certain purpose. They do not have independent thoughts or powers. They simply exist in relationship to each other as God originally ordered them in the beginning and continues to uphold them.
When I was doing my research and reading through the Mesopotamian texts, I was struck by the amount of things that I found in there that I did see looked like people in the biblical authors, specifically Solomon, were quoting almost verbatim. Somebody like Solomon, it would make sense because he married so many different women and different cultures. They would have brought their own stuff with them and their own, religious beliefs and whatnot. So it wouldn't surprise me that he had read those things, but to see them quoted in the Bible, I found rather interesting. And my take on it was that, characters like Nimrod and whatnot may have had a few hundred years to tell their side of the story. And then Yahweh showed up and said, okay, come up come on up here, Moses. Let me tell you what really happened. You got a pen? Okay, in the beginning, you getting this? It says Moses spoke with him face to face as one speaks with a friend. So,
yes.
It seemed to me that Moses was setting the record straight, but for, 800 plus years after the flood or so, Nimrod's story sort of prevailed.
And my theory is that there was a foundation text which God gave to man, to Adam and Eve, in the beginning. It was passed down from the patriarchs to Noah through the post-flood world. And after a period of time, there was a divergence. You start to have a kind of a polytheistic approach being taken to this story, where it wasn't just objects that God created, but actual deities that were battling together. That is a sort of Nimrod line you're talking about. My theory is that the Abrahamic and, the patriarchal line carried the true version, and the Nimrod Babylonian line carried the sort of a polytheistic version. They both were based on the same information, but they had two different takes on it. One was a monotheistic, and the other was a polytheistic. And in fact, the book of Job, I believe, is actually the original monotheistic version of the creation material. It is, in fact, the Hebrew parallel text to the Babylonian creation epic, written in the form of a dialogue between a single deity and mankind, rather than as a sort of a dramatic battle between many deities, as there's with the polytheists. So I want to make that clear. I do not believe that the biblical text was a modification of Sumerian originals. I do believe there are parallel versions which evolved separately from an original foundation text, story which God gave to man in the beginning, and which was corrupted by the polytheistic tendencies of the Sumerians and Babylonians.
Yeah, because that's one of the typical arguments you hear is, well, Moses just ripped off the Sumerians. Mm-hmm. And I don't see that to be the case at all.
Moses was taught all the learning and knowledge of the Egyptians. But you don't see a lot of the knowledge and learning of the Egyptians in the Bible. You see a subset of it. Mm-hmm. The Egyptians had a lot of knowledge which was worthwhile, but a lot of it had become corrupted and became polytheistized and just became corrupted with magical thinking. Magical thinking is like how a child or a liberal might think. They just, think things happen magically, poof, it happens. There's reason and order and logic behind the universe, and things happen for a reason because God causes them to happen. There is cause and effect. There's not magic that just happens. There's a reason for everything. Jesus is referred to as the Logos for a reason. He is the ultimate ordering principle, the principle of logic behind the entire universe, which orders it and upholds it since the beginning to this day. Thus, God is the ultimate God of logic, and those who think magically and think in terms of imaginative, vain, childish things, those are those who think like the devil.
No, in your book you were talking about Planet X in relation to the statement that is made, a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day. Mm-hmm. Why don't you unpack that a little bit for us? What is your take on that? How does it relate to Planet X?
Well, it says the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord, let me look that up real quick.
That's toward the end of your book, page 417.
Let's see. Page
417.
417.
And the reason I bring that up is because you, in that area there, you're quoting Ginsberg's Legend of the Jews, and I had posted something on my Facebook page earlier this week, something that I had found in Legends, and you wrote on my wall, you're like, there's a lot of cool stuff in Legends.
Yes, Legend of the Jews holds many clues. I would read Cave of the Treasures and understand that. That has some interesting information in it.
That's in the Lost Books of Adam and Eve? Something like that.
That is not, I want to make sure that's not scripture.
Right. At
all. It is a story. But it is a story which has information in it which I believe will be relevant to the end times. Okay? That is an aside which, I'll be actually writing about that in my book on the giants. But the day of the Lord, which occurs every 1,000 years, actually 2,000 years, I should correct myself, is measured by each appearance of Planet X in the heavens. It's sort of the shorthand on the slow hand, the hour hand on the divine clock. This happens much less frequently than, say, the orbit of Jupiter or Uranus or Neptune. When this sweeping hand, this very slow moving hand, let's say give it a third hand on a clock, which measures out 2,000 years. Whenever this hits the appropriate time, God will reappear, which I believe is around 2,000 years. But I believe that, I think it was Paul, talked about this. Every 2,000 years, he says the day of the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like one day. The day of the Lord, which is also referred to in Scripture as a day of judgment. The day of the Lord is sort of a term which means the day of God's wrath, the day of God's judgment, and so forth. This day of judgment happens every 2,000 years whenever Planet X returns and God uses it to judge the earth. And it's divided into two sections, a day of 1,000 years and a night of 1,000 years. And what this means is 1,000 years, Planet X is traveling out of the solar system into the darkness, or quote-unquote night. And every day of the Lord is 1,000 years when Planet X returns back into the solar system towards the light, which is the day. So there's a day of 1,000 years and a night of 1,000 years, making a total day of 2,000 years. Just like there's a roughly 12-hour day and a roughly 12-hour night, making a total of 24 hours for a complete day on Earth.
Okay, so I see what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the day of the Lord is every 2,000 years when Planet X returns to judge the earth. That is the judgment. And it says, I think it's Isaiah 51, the Lord returns from the end of heaven with weapons of his indignation. It actually says in that passage that it's a physical place, a land that is out at the end of heaven, a physical place. That's the word land there, means literally a clod of dirt. It is a physical place. It's not a spiritual realm. It's a physical thing. And this physical thing goes and returns from the end of heaven, comes back to judge earth. That's, I think it's Isaiah 51. I'll have to look that up. But that literally means that God is or is somehow associated with a literal physical object, which actually goes and returns in heaven at a certain amount of time. And when it returns, the earth is judged.
Now, if we go with that route, we see whatever's coming, the day of the Lord, is certainly going to be a time of terrible darkness and judgment and everything like that. But 2,000 years ago, when it came last time, he didn't so much come to judge, but rather to redeem, wouldn't you say?
Yes, the 2,000 years previous to that, 2000 BC, there was the downfall of Sumer. When the Sumerians, and this is actually probably around the time of the book of Job, which I believe actually happened at the same time. And the Sumerians actually were destroyed by fire from heaven when they saw their god Enlil appear in heaven. Enlil being corresponding to Planet X in the old Babylonian creation epic. Same deity or object as Marduk or Anu. The various deities of the various peoples were matched up with this planet. It would have returned every once in a while. And they saw basically the god Enlil, this bright star or planet, appear in the heavens yet and reappear. And so they knew they were about to be judged. And they said fire was thrown down by Enlil from heaven, and it destroyed the empire of Sumer. And they've since that time, and I talked about this in my chapter on Job, they found a large asteroid crater in southeastern Iraq, which corresponds to around that time. And it was large enough so that the impact would have obliterated any kind of life around the crater, and it caused serious destruction for miles and miles away. And this was probably responsible for the down of Ur III, better known as the Ur of the Chaldees of the Bible and of Abraham specifically. So God actually called Abraham out of Ur right before he was destroyed.
Interesting.
Just as I called
Lot
out of Sodom right before it was destroyed. There was a lot of meteoric and asteroidal activity happening around that time. And he called them out just before the destruction came in both instances, in my opinion. And so we know for sure Ur was destroyed. We see the evidence. They talked about it in their books, the Lament over the destruction of Sumer and Ur. They actually wrote a lamentation text describing what happened. They said, Enlil threw fire down from heaven to earth, destroyed Sumer. There was a blast of fire. There was a shockwave which obliterated everything, and then there was a flooding rain afterwards, which is exactly what would happen if an asteroid struck in that area, because the area where the crater was found was a marshland. So you're going to have a blast wave, you're going to have fire burning up what's left, and then as the water from the marshlands comes back down, it'll flood everywhere, just like you might expect, which is exactly what would happen if an asteroid hit in the marshlands. So I believe that not only the destruction of the empire of Sumer, but also the destruction of Job's holdings was also the same event. Job was actually talked about as the chief of the men of the East. East of Israel would have been Sumer. So I believe he was actually the richest man in Sumer, making him one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful man on Earth at that time, at least the richest one. And so the destruction of Job should be considered the same event as the destruction of Sumer, and by the same event, which is one or more asteroids striking the Earth and causing massive destruction, possibly by Planet X hurling one of our asteroids out of the belt, or possibly one of our asteroids it brought along with it in its train, because it probably has a huge amount of asteroidal and comet material following around in its orbit, because the giant impact when it's struck and divided Earth has caused a lot of material to be thrown up in space. A lot of it was probably kept and captured in Planet X's orbital, gravitational pull, where it remains to this day.
That's fascinating, because if what you're saying is true, and I'm looking at the graphic you have on page 348 of your book showing the possible impact site there, approximate strike point. Yeah, because if that's true, then you have a major catastrophic event happening for the creation.
Mm-hmm.
And then, depending on who you read and what your calculations are, Abraham's born anywhere between 1948 and 2000 BC.
Yeah.
And at that time, Nimrod is king, according to the book of Joshua. He was king the same year that Abraham was born. And they said that his birth was heralded by a star.
Right. So that would have been Planet X appearing 2,000 years previous to Jesus. It shows up again 2,000 years later to herald the birth of Christ as the Star of Bethlehem. At this particular time, no significant asteroidal bombardment occurred to our knowledge. That doesn't mean Planet X didn't pass through. It just means we didn't get struck.
Right. Further.
And then 2,000 years after that, I believe it will return again as the sign of the Son of Man at the end of the age, according to the predetermined pattern described by the ancients.
And I mean, that's fascinating on multiple levels, because if you go and look at, Abraham's called out of Ur of the Chaldees, he's 50, 70 years old, something like that, when he's called out of there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're saying sometime shortly after he's called out of there, that place gets obliterated. And
right.
Then he finds his way into Canaan. There's a whole deal with Lot, and Lot goes down to Sodom and Gomorrah. Then there's the whole thing with Sodom and Gomorrah, which, in terms of time, we're still talking about a fairly close time period from the apparent destruction of Sumer and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
It would have been around the same time.
Within 25 to 50 years, I would seem.
Yeah. It's there's probably all kinds of stuff flying around. In fact, when I calculated Planet X's orbit, it actually hangs around for a couple of decades. It's relatively slow moving. If it has a 2,000-year orbit, it actually moves fairly slowly, and it's going to be slowly moving as it passes up from beneath the ecliptic up into it. It passes through the asteroid belt and then above the ecliptic, where it stands as Nibiru, as the Sumerians describe it. Mm. That period of time is like a couple of decades. It's moving pretty slowly. Throughout its orbit, it's actually, in order to have a 2,000-year orbit of, 10-to-1 ratio of ellipticity, it's moving maybe an average of 1,000 or 2,000 miles per hour, I think, or something like that. I forget the exact number. But it's actually moving pretty slowly, so it might have been visible for a number of years, meaning during most of the time of Christ, it was visible in the heavens.
Talk back.
No fear. We are TFR. Frequency Radio.
And welcome back to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba. For the second hour of the broadcast, we're talking with Douglas Elwell about his book, Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age. And right before the break, you were talking about how it's a slow-moving object, and I was just thinking about that. It's like, okay, going back to the Abraham Sumer Sodom and Gomorrah issue, if the thing's coming in and happens to go through or disturb in any way the asteroid belt, then it would seem that, you know, if it goes on ahead of that disturbance, then it could cause, say, destruction of Sumer, and then over a period of time, not too long afterward, maybe be what was responsible for the fire and brimstone that came down on Sodom and Gomorrah. What do you think about that? Is that...
It could be. As Planet X passes through the asteroid belt, it's probably through the solar system, it's probably throwing a lot of material around, with the effect that it's like a shooting gallery, and it's hit or miss, like with shotgun pellets. It's hit or miss whether that Earth, not only, you know, not a question of whether the Earth will get hit, but whether or not how much it'll be hit by it, because there's all kinds of stuff going on. There's all kinds of different asteroidal classes like Aten and the other near-Earth asteroids, all kinds of things going on, and adding another asteroidal cluster coming in with Planet X would make things extra interesting. I actually talk about at length the orbital period and eccentricity of Planet X in my near the end, from pages 411 to 414. My estimate based on 100 AU distance from the Sun, giving an orbital eccentricity of 1.9. That is a highly elliptical, flattened orbit. It would be traveling approximately 1.12 AU astronomical units per year, or about 9,847 miles per hour. That would give it, as it passes through our inner solar system, it would take 9.48 years to go up one side of the asteroid belt and go back down the other one. So it was actually visible from the Earth for the better part of a decade, since it appeared not only at the birth of Christ, but it might have been around for a number of years in his early childhood. This might explain why Jesus says in the book of Revelation, "I am the bright and morning star." He was consistently associated with this star, both its appearance and its return.
Well, you know, that's fascinating too, because I'm sure you've probably done some research on the alignment of September 11th, 3 BC, with Jupiter over Regulus and Leo, and
I've heard of that. Yes, that was one of the alignments theories.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to be a perfect fulfillment of the description in Revelation 12 regarding the woman clothed with the sun, stars at her head, moon at her feet, and that whole deal. But if that is, now I'm just thinking out loud here, but if that is the sign of his birth, and in conjunction with that, Planet X is showing up, and the Magi follow, because the Magi everybody's got the nativity scene with the Magi there, but that's not true. They didn't show up till he's about almost 2 years old. So if what you're saying is true, then it could very well make sense then that they saw that sign, that got their attention, and then they see this Planet X thing come in, and that's hanging around long enough for them to follow it.
Right.
And theoretically hanging around for a little while longer, even when Jesus goes down to Egypt, which if what you're saying is true, that's fascinating to me because, well, let me ask you this. Do you think that the Osiris, sun in the disk with the wings, is related to whatever they were seeing in 2000 BC for maybe a decade in this?
The Egyptian winged disk, it's possible.
Well, and the Sumerians too.
The Sumerians, yeah, that appears to be representative of Marduk, or the high deity of all the major pantheons, Ashur, Marduk. They had this winged disk, which was kind of a unique look, and it corresponded to this winged disk concept, which was in Sumerian, art, showing this planet-like object, which appeared to have these wings. Yeah. And if a large planet which had comet-like characteristics, and essentially, in terms of characteristics, Planet X is basically a gigantic comet. Yeah. And its orbital path, its relative speed, it's like a long period comet, which is like the size of a large, pretty good sized planet. And so I think the characteristics of a planet-sized comet, instead of having just a tail, which is also shown in the Sumerian texts or the imagery, it would also have what would appear to be huge wings. And so I think they were showing a planet with comet-like characteristics. They were saying this is how it looked. It had these streamers of this ion trail, not only coming off the tail, but also off the sides, effectively making it look like it has wings. This is probably what they're talking about. I think it's the book of Zechariah, or the last book of the Old Testament, which says, the Son of Righteousness with healing in its wings. This is probably what it's talking about, this winged sun, quote unquote, which appears in the end times, which appears to have what look like wings. These comet-like tails or wings, which are basically the comet-like appendages of an ion trail and sublimated water vapor, which, when it came close to Earth, would reflect so much light back on the Earth. The day would be 7 times as bright, and the night would be like a normal day.
So if this winged disc thing is becoming known as a symbol for a god, let's put it that way, depending on your cultural perspective.
Yes.
Marduk to the Sumerians, Osiris. Then when the son of the god went down to Egypt, if this sign was in the heavens, that's rather interesting.
Yeah, it might have been visible that entire time, for a period of 10 years. How old was Jesus when he appeared in the temple as a child? Was he 8 or 9?
Yeah, he's 12 when he's in the temple.
12?
So,
okay. It could be that it disappeared around that time.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could make sense. I mean, as far as I know, there's nothing that I'm aware of, no text that tells you when they returned from Egypt. I mean, exactly how old he was when he came back. Mm-hmm. I could be wrong, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. But I know you don't get much until he's 12, which is in the temple, and then you don't really get anything until he's about 30.
Right. It could be we can adjust the Planet X's orbital period based on the life and the events of Jesus. If we plug in the 12-year time for the Planet X being inside the inner solar system, we could actually derive a much more accurate orbital path.
It's a fascinating theory, and if we take that now to the end times, then we have this thing that people refer to as the 7-year tribulation period. So do you think, in your view, is this thing entering in and beginning all of this stuff, or how does it play into the last days?
My theory is that the great secret of Revelation that will be revealed is Planet X itself. It is a great secret. And actually, Revelation is actually alluded to in chapters 1 through 3. I'll go through this briefly. He's talking about the angels of the churches. And he says, let's see. At the end of chapter 2, he says, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father, and I will give him the morning star. I believe this is actually a reference to the destruction of the early Earth, which was struck by a satellite of Planet X, and like a potter's, like a clay pot. And he says, I received that of my Father. That was, the Father had done that. He caused Planet X to destroy the early Earth, striking it, and Planet X still orbited in heaven as sort of a star, which would appear every once in a while. And at the end of the end of chapter 3, he says, let's see, to whom that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and I sat down with my Father in his throne. And then in Revelation 4, so you have this description of a star, and you have a description of a throne. And then in chapter 4, he talks about the throne, which is basically described as, it says, it was to look upon like a jasper and a sardine stone, with a rainbow around about the throne, inside like an emerald. This is Revelation 4. So he's saying literally that it is like a jasper or sardine stone in heaven. It is a stone in heaven. And the color here is just the jasper and sardine. I think it's supposed to be red. And there was a rainbow around the throne inside like an emerald. And around about the throne were 420 seats with 420 elders. And there was also 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And then there's the sea of glass like crystal and so forth. I believe this is actually a description of Planet X. This is how it actually looks. It is, and this is actually, if you read Enumerations, this is remarkably similar to the description of Marduk as he appeared. He too also had, let's see, I actually talk about this on page 4036. I have a table comparing the two. Marduk's main weapon was a mace. And in Jesus, the Star of Jesus is described as a scepter at the end of chapter 2, that he used to shatter the earth. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk was described as having a flood storm, and the one on the throne was said to have hair as white as wool and snow. It's actually also in Daniel, I believe, the Ancient of Days. This is actually a very good description of a comet-like tail, which the word comet, cometes, literally means white hair. So you have this concept of white hair, a hairy star. Comet literally means a hairy star. So you have this similar concept in ancient Hebrew as a being has hair white as wool. This is actually a description of Planet X with its long, white, comet-like, hairy, wings. Another way to look at it is a face with like hair on either side. Marduk is described as a red star in the Babylonian creation texts, and in the sardine stone, here in Revelation 4, sardine stone is a red stone also. Marduk's head was turbid with a fearsome halo. This throne was surrounded by a sea of glass crystal. I interpret that as being a ring system like that of Saturn. Now this is where it gets particularly interesting. Both Enuma Elish and Revelation 4 describe two groups of things that surround God. In Enuma Elish it's described as 4 winds, and in Revelation 4 it's described as 4 beasts. And there's also another group of 7 winds in Enuma Elish, which is described in Revelation 4 as 7 lamps of fire. My interpretation of that is that there are actually 4 primary satellites that rotate around Planet X, and an additional 7 secondary satellites which also rotate out a little farther probably. So what you have here is a large red planet with a huge comet-like tail. It has a ring system, a total of 11 satellites. And there's more to it but that's basically how it looks. And if Planet X actually interacted with our outer solar system regularly, it probably picked out a lot of material and satellites from the outer planets. So it apparently has 11 large satellites, and a ring system like Saturn. So this is that plus a huge comet-like tail. It's an amazing apparition in heaven. It will be terrifying to everyone on earth, and that's why it says in the book of Revelation, when God's throne appears in heaven, at the 6th seal being opened, they see this thing starting to appear visibly for the first time. This is around the middle of the tribulation, and they're terrified of it because they realize this gigantic, vicious planet is coming right for them. And this is going to be one incredible apparition. It's going to be, it will cause such terror on earth that all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, as described in Revelation 24:30.
Is this the same thing that the Hopi Indians are referring to as the Red Kachina and the Blue Kachina?
That I don't know about. I've heard that theory before. I tend to stay away from Native American myths because they're just too far removed from the ancient Near East ones. But it's possible they might be referring to something like this.
I can see people listening to this right now saying, well, it sounds like you're telling us that God's riding around on this planet out there. Is that what you're saying, or what? I mean, do you believe heaven is in another realm, another dimension, or is heaven this planet and he's riding on it like a big Death Star, or what's your take on it?
It says that in the Babylonian creation epic that Marduk mounted the throne chariot. It was a war chariot, and God is also referred to having this chariot which he rides around in heaven. In fact, I think it was actually Isaiah 13. It was. He comes from the end of heaven in his war chariot kind of concept. This is a chariot. He doesn't necessarily live on it, but he uses it metaphorically as sort of a war chariot. I don't know if he actually is physically present on it or not, but it has the effect of being kind of like a war chariot, which he rides or directs towards Earth, towards the effect of judging it and causing great destruction upon his enemies. It's Isaiah 13. Let me read a little bit to you here. The noise of a multitude in the mountains like as of a great people, and the tumultuous noise of the kingdom of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts musters the hosts of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. And it talks about, and later in that chapter, for the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in its going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And I will punish the world for their evil and the wicked for their iniquity. and will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. So this is a reference at the end times, in which God will come from a far country from the end of heaven. The word far country literally means a physical location. That is in heaven. It is moving in heaven because it's coming from the end of heaven. So it is moving towards Earth from someplace farther out in space, indicated as a path, apparently an orbital path. And that would be basically the perfect description of a planet, as seen from the perspective of a Hebrew who doesn't necessarily understand how the planets work. They basically simplified it and said God is out in this physical location. He's coming back towards Earth, and then he will judge the Earth with these powerful weapons he is bringing with him, which are described in Revelation 4 as these huge, the beasts and the lamps of fire, these bowls poured out, which are probably comets and asteroids which are hurled towards Earth as Planet X passes through the solar system, just like he did in 2000 BC, judging the Empire of Sumer. So too, he will not only judge the Empire of Sumer, he'll judge the entire Earth.
And you mentioned a second ago constellations, and on page 330 of your book, you're talking about God's throne in heaven, and you speculate here, it looks like, the Orion Nebula, located in the sword region of the constellation of Orion, like all nebula, is a place where stars are born, and thus the Hebrew term hufat, bridal chamber, is an appropriate description of this region where God will most likely appear when he returns, according to Psalm 19. You and in the previous pages, it looks like you're talking about, you think that it's going to come from Orion? It's going through Orion?
Yeah. Yes. Excuse me. In the last chapter, I actually talk about one of the riddles of a hidden message in chapters 1 through 3 is that he is actually secretly describing where he will actually reappear in heaven. Now, David Flynn wrote in one of his books that the area of modern-day Turkey, an ancient Asia Minor, was actually corresponded with the constellation of Taurus, because the constellations were mapped over the constellations of Earth by the ancients. Now, in the churches, the 7 churches recognized in chapters 1 through 3 of the book of Revelation, are actually located in north and southwestern Asia Minor. So they're actually located, and I talk about this on page 432. They're actually located in the face of the bull. In fact, one of the churches actually corresponds to the eye of the bull, and the idea of the Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, being associated with the constellation of Taurus is still reflected to this day, that the major mountain chains in Turkey are still called the Taurus Mountains.
You're right.
So they're reflecting the fact that this is associated with the constellation of Taurus. And the island of Patmos, it says Jesus is walking among the 7 stars, which 7 with lamps, which are also 7 stars, which 7 churches which are also 7 stars. I do believe he's giving away a clue hidden in plain sight, saying that the return of Planet X will be in or near the face of Taurus.
Now, Pleiades are in that general vicinity too, aren't they?
True, but the 7 churches actually most closely correspond to another group called the Hyades, which is a group of 5 stars, which, if you include the 2 for the horns, that makes a total of 7. It could be the Pleiades, which is actually only 6 bright stars in that group. No, it could be that too. But the most important thing is that Jesus appeared to John on the island of Patmos. Patmos is just west of the coast of Asia Minor, just west of the 7 churches, which in heaven would be just west of the Hyades, the face of the bull of Taurus. So I do believe the first visible sighting of Planet X will appear when it appears just west of the face of Taurus, as Jesus described in the book of Revelation, because as the 7 churches in the face of the bull correspond to the Hyades and the constellation of Taurus, so the relative location of Planet X's appearance will be relative to the island of Patmos, relative to the 7 churches on Earth.
Interesting. So, and when west of Taurus, as you're looking at it, is Orion.
Right. So it'll appear as it comes. It appears first just in front of the face of Taurus. It will move through Orion as well, and possibly through that region, of the bridal chamber. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned Psalm 19. I actually reinterpret this as well. People don't understand this, is that as our previous discussion, the idea that Psalm 19 is actually describing the sun moving through the heavens. I actually think it's describing God as moving through the heavens, or specifically planet X. God is being used in a generic way. It says, their line has gone throughout the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun. And at least in the King James Version, it's translated as, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. I do believe the word translated here as which is actually the word who, which means he, and refers not to the sun, but actually refers to God. This refers to a person and not a thing. So it actually says God comes as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber and rejoices as a strong man to run a race. His going forth, that is of planet X, his going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit or circle, or in planetary terms, orbit, unto the ends of it. So it literally says in Psalm 19 that God moves in a circle in heaven.
And the idea that if he's coming in the general vicinity of Orion, that's fascinating to me, because I just finished a series a little while ago, or at the end of last year, that I called the Yahuwah Triangle, parts 1, 2, and 3. And in the part 1 section dealing with the Great Pyramid and the star shafts and what stars they were pointing to and stuff, it forced me to start looking into the book The Gospel in the Stars by Joseph Seiss and The Witness in the Stars by E.W. Bullinger. And in both cases, both authors gave an alternative view of Orion from that which I had held prior, because most of the research that I had done prior to that was dealing with Nimrod and all that kind of stuff, and the Mighty Hunter and all that, and that Orion was linked to Osiris, and Osiris linked to Nimrod, and Nimrod the Mighty Hunter, and the Mighty Hunter in the constellation, blah, blah, blah. But Seiss and Bullinger basically tried to interpret the stars from the Mazzaroth perspective of what God had in mind when he created them. And Bullinger divided the stars up into what he called the 4 star books, that, the 4 seasons was 3 constellations leading those 4. So basically in the 4 star books of the sky, it just like the 4 gospels, it's telling the story of creation to the end times in 4 different ways. And in that case, Orion represents God, or Yeshua, as the conquering one of light that will take out Draco, the dragon. And so if that's the case, and I don't know if you've read it or not, but it's a fascinating read, both of those books.
I've read them, yeah.
Specifically relating to Orion, then it fits what you're saying, because if he's showing up through Orion in that general vicinity, to conquer the dragon in the last days, then it certainly seems to fit.
I actually think that, I used to agree with Seiss and Bullinger, but I actually think that Orion actually corresponds to Nimrod, the opposer, who opposes the onrushing, returning king. Right. So the bull actually represents God returning from, the end of heaven, and Nimrod is set up opposing that return. Nimrod, Orion. In fact, Nimrod was, I think I found links between Nimrod and Orion in ancient Near Eastern mythology, and
that's cool.
The kings. So it's pretty clear. So I don't think that is Christ. I think that is Antichrist, and the one who opposes that second coming. He raises up the fist to heaven. He attempts to oppose Christ's coming, and he is the one who is crushed and defeated. He has aspects of being like Christ, but he is not.
Yeah, I wrote that in Babylon Rising, the same thing, that woe to the Assyrian in whose hand is the club of my wrath.
Yep. And
it was linking scriptures like that to Nimrod. Whatever the case may be, Orion's clearly playing a role in this. And you have in Job where he's talking about, can you loose the bands of Orion and bind the influence of the Pleiades? Do you think that that's all related to some sort of manifestation of Planet X?
I do believe Job was basically talking about all about various pieces of information regarding Planet X's movement through heavens. My theory is that Job was actually the Hebrew version of the Babylonian creation epic. This parallel text which has the same information encoded into it, but formatted in a way that is monotheistic instead of polytheistic. So if you go throughout, I have actually an entire chapter dedicated to the book of Job, and how the numerous references to a battle between God and a dragon throughout Job, which it's amazing how many references there are. In fact, if you look in terms of total number of creation, there's more stuff in Job than anywhere else in the Bible.
That thought. We'll back up the break.
Degrees of Insanity with Donnie Gilson.
Sunday on Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba. For the last half-hour segment of this broadcast, we are talking with Douglas Elwell about Planet X. And right before the break, you were discussing its role in the book of Job and how Job relates to the various creation epics.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we get into that, I wanted to do a further exegesis of Psalm 19. I actually did a particularly deep description on page 325 to 326, talking about Psalm 19, verse 5, which as a bridegroom going out of his chamber and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. I actually looked at the Hebrew and found some very interesting things. And it says, the word to rejoice actually means to leap, to spring, or to rejoice, to jump. And the word, like a strong man, is literally the word Gibor, a mighty hunter, like Orion is actually Nimrod is described as a mighty hunter, literally a Gibor. So this is a link with Nimrod. And to run, the word of race is actually the word orach, which means a path or race, or specifically a bull run, where bulls used to run in a circle. So we have here a reference to not only to a sort of a leaping hunter, you also have a place where bulls will run in a circle. So I believe this is they use this particular word to describe a sort of an orbital path, which is related to the constellation of Taurus, the bull. And so Orion is going to be seen, and there was actually in the ancient world there was a practice what's called bull leaping. Which where in order to show their prowess as men would actually jump over a bull in order to prove that they have the ability to overcome the power of the bull. So I think you have the idea of a leaping hunter or a leaping warrior jumping over a bull kind of encapsulates the idea of this being who opposes the power of the bull, idea of Nimrod, Orion, opposing the onrushing bull of Taurus. And so there's many layers here. Plus the word auroch is probably where we could derive the word aurochs, which is the name of an ancient form of bull, which is about 6 foot tall at the shoulder. And I further define that as probably the combination of the Hebrew word for light, which is or, and possibly the word och, which probably is the word for ox we get today. So the constellation of Taurus should be thought of as a light ox, an ox made of light, or a constellation. So it has many different levels. There's a lot of deep stuff in here, clearly identifying the orbital path of Planet X as being related to the constellation of Taurus, the ox of light.
Fascinating. So what were you got cut off before we went to the break? Where were you wanting to go on the issue of Job?
Well, Job is basically a fleshing out of the entire, all of the material then present at the time of the destruction of Sumer. Just as the Anunnaki was written by the Babylonians after they moved in and took over the region that was devastated. They, I think it was a couple of hundred years later, they wrote like a memorial text, which was a huge deal, which they called Anunnaki, which was a kind of a compilation of all the texts that have been recovered from the Sumerian Empire, from the ruins and from the scribes who survived. And they put together this long, concise description of the creation as, you know, as a battle between the Babylonian god Marduk, whom they used to replace Enlil, with the Sumerian deity, and the goddess Tiamat. And from this battle was the earth created in its present form. But I do believe at the same time the Hebrews, monotheists, were putting together a different book, a different tradition, in which there was only one God. And I do believe that is the origin of the creation of the book of Job, where they created a story based on a real person and events in the life of that person, and incorporated a lot of the same information that you find in Enuma-Elish in a different way. For example, my theory is that, first of all, the timing of the book of Job was set as being around 1900, I think it was 1917 BC, because there were actually two gatherings of the planets in the heavens on the same side of the heavens and in the same quarter of the sky, which is a very unusual event. This actually happened twice. Around 2000 BC it happened twice, and I do believe that the gathering of the sons of God in heaven in the first two chapters of Job are actually a description of this gathering of the planets in heaven. And so they're using this gathering as a timing for the events of Job, as of being around sometime between 1900 and 2000 BC. And interestingly, there's a parallel in the book of, or in Enuma-Elish, where there's a gathering of the gods in heaven, not once but twice. Just as in the book of Job, you have the gathering of the gods in heaven, and you have the gathering of the sons of God in heaven, not once but twice. And so I think that this is both of their way of timing the events of the book of Job and Enuma-Elish, timing the events of the destruction of Sumer, as having been somewhere between 1900 and 2000 BC. And I think that's how they were able to time it. The Sumerians and Babylonians frequently used gathering of stars and constellations and planets to mark actual, as time markers in time. So we can actually determine, based on what planets are shown in various stelae and statues, when the statues were carved, which you can tell where the moon is, where the planet Venus is relative to it in the background stars, like the Pleiades, for example. We can tell by looking at that. This was, like about 700 something BC, plus or minus a few weeks. So this is how they actually timed their events, by actually carving images of stars and planets into their statues and stelae in order to actually put a date on them. So I believe Job is actually dated to that time using the same technique. Now specifically, Job actually talks a great deal about the battle between God and the dragon. This really starts around, my theory is actually Job is actually in this story. He is seen as Tiamat's chief helper, Kingu, also known as Behemoth in the book of Job. And the correlation to Tiamat is actually Sumer itself. And so as the chief of the men of the east, he was the chief of the equivalent of chief of the dragon's brood. And so he was kind of the enemy of God. And that explains why Job is given the name Job, because the word Job actually means enemy. It's based on the word ayah, which means enemy. So Job is this enemy of God, which God is fighting against and destroying. And at the same time, he's destroying the empire of Sumer with his fire from heaven. Everything is destroyed by this blast of fire and wind. And so this is basically the Hebrew version of the Babylonian creation epic.
But Job is listed as being righteous and following the Lord.
There's the major difference. It's a little bit different. Job, you have to explain why is Job named the enemy, because he is actually not bad, but he's treated like he is. So it's an interesting twist on the story. Unlike in the Babylonian creation epic, where Kingu is seen as totally evil and irredeemable. If Job repents in dust and ashes, he is redeemed by God. And that's one of the critical differences in these texts, is there's a chance of redemption, whereas in New Elish, all opponents of God are destroyed without hope of redemption.
So, kind of bringing it full circle in the remaining 17 minutes we have left, Last Days. Now, we've got shows like Ancient Aliens on right now, promoting von Daniken and Sitchin's views, basically, of Anunnaki and this planet Nibiru that may be coming. How does all that play into this? What do you? Of course, I think it's all a big counterfeit. But what do you think? What's the deal with the Anunnaki and their relation to Nibiru?
I don't know if there's a relationship with Nibiru or not. They do in the New Elish. They're actually described as coming down from heaven to earth. They're not specifically associated with Marduk. They're just kind of the general drama of the gods, and they're associated with the gods, but it doesn't say actually they came down from planet X per se. A lot of this stuff is the Anunnaki would correspond neatly with the Nephilim, actually the fallen angels of the Bible. Their name literally means those who came down from heaven to earth. Anu is heaven and Ki is earth. And so these are the ones who came down from above to below. That's basically what they are. And they interfere with mankind and gave man civilization and writing and literature. And as a result, this was a combination, a net effect of being both good and evil. Because in some cases the knowledge was used for good, but in other cases evil. And this should correspond with the knowledge of good and evil and described in the garden, and Satan coming down and tempting Adam and Eve and so forth, and tampering with their genetics and creating Cain, and after them the line of giants, which came to fruition in Genesis 6 as when the fallen angels, which would correspond to the Anunnaki in the Sumerian texts, came down and began intermarrying with man on a large scale, giving them knowledge, giving them technology, the ability to read and write and create architecture. Most specifically, they seem to have an obsession with pyramids and ziggurats and large pyramidal structures of various types, as if they were trying to recreate something in heaven they once lived in, but had been thrown down from. My theory is that they were thrown down from a pyramidal city in heaven, and they tried to reproduce this city on Earth, but did an inferior job, relatively speaking. But that's basically what's happening, and in the end times they'll come down again, try to recreate this pyramidal structure, which might not be a physical pyramid, but more of an electronic pyramid, which might be what the internet ultimately will resolve as, sort of an electronic pyramid on the top of which the Antichrist will reign and rule over the earth, as the symbol of the Freemasons of this great eye on the top of a pyramid. This might be a symbol of the Antichrist, and the pyramid is this system which he creates near the end of time, through which he can rule the earth, which I think is actually the internet. So these Anunnaki, which these ancient alien shows just, are kind of these kind of slipshod, populistic tripe, which is confusing to some, but it might be part of the great deception in that they will believe the lie and the silly idea that we were created by aliens and so forth. That might be part of the great deception of the end times. Yeah, I agree with that. When
you say that it may be the pyramid may be a representation of something in heaven, are you saying something in an ethereal heaven, or are you saying something on this physical planet X that it may have pyramidal structures on it?
I don't know exactly. I was actually when you read Revelation 21 and the description of the New Jerusalem, that could be interpreted as either a cube,
right,
or a pyramid, or something in between, like a flat top pyramid. Patrick Hare believed it was actually a pyramid, and I thought his arguments were good, so I've actually leaned more towards a pyramid, even though I initially balked at the idea because it's so associated with the New Age and occult. Right. It occurred to me that the occult pyramids might actually be satanic counterfeits of a true pyramid in heaven.
Right. I came to the same conclusion on the series I just mentioned, the Yahuwah Triangle. And it really, his book, Patrick Heron's book, Nephilim and the Pyramid of the Apocalypse, was the first time I'd ever considered that. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting take, because I was always a cube guy. myself, but it was actually Doug Hamp that pushed me over the edge. He's the one that Patrick loosened me up, and then Doug threw me over the edge on that. So I'm now fully embracing the New Jerusalem as a pyramid, which actually does make a lot of sense to me, and why it would be counterfeited.
Well, if you think about it, if Jesus is the lamp thereof, and he assumedly sits at the top of it, and if you have a square, from certain angles you can't see the top of it.
Sure. It
has to be a pyramid, because otherwise, certain angles you cannot see Jesus. The only way to have a full view from any direction of the top would be to have a pyramidal structure.
Right. And in that case, he's sort of as Scripture says, the chief cornerstone. He's the focal point. And, the all-seeing eye, that's a counterfeit. That's a pipe dream of Lucifer wanting to usurp that position.
Yes, as it's described in, Ezekiel? He wanted to, mount, the heaven of the top of the mountain of God and sit in the throne of God. That's what he's talking about, this great pyramid. And I talk about this in my book on the giants. It's actually the beginning, about the fall of Lucifer, how he attempted to overthrow the sun who sat on top of the pyramid, but failed and was cast down into the abyss. And this destruction happened, and from this destruction, the universe, as we understand it, was created. This divine conflict at a higher plane of reality was manifested in a lower plane as what we call the universe.
Now you mentioned you're talking about Lucifer here. What do you think's going on with the Lucifer telescope and the Vatican? Or do you think they have Planet X in sight? What do you think's going on with all that?
My theory is it's primarily used to look for Planet X. Yes. There's no other real use for it. The stars are too far away to study, and you can't see aliens with it because it's too slow to see them. It's designed only for the telescopes of that size are only for observing planets and stars. And there's no reason for them to study the stars. They can just use NASA stuff. They're looking for Planet X.
Why do you think they're obsessed with finding Planet X? I mean, it's nothing we can do about it. If it's coming, it's coming, right? I mean, what are we going to stop it?
They want to know where it's coming from and to be prepared for it.
Now, from their perspective, what does that mean, be prepared for it? What do you think?
Well, the book of Revelation is replete with destructive events, which basically sound like asteroids and comets hitting the Earth. In fact, the trumpets basically just sound like various asteroidal and comet impacts on the Earth and in the seas. So when they're able to, first of all, prove it's coming, they can say, look, we have proof of the existence of God. Here is his planet. And they may have come to the same conclusion I have decades ago. And they just decided to put their money where their mouth is and actually build a telescope to find the planet and prove it exists. And then by extension prove that the Bible is true.
Or they could probably, I don't really trust the Vatican as far as I could throw them. If you're saying that this is the planet of God, that sounds awful lot like Mormon theology and Freemasonry.
I don't know if it's a planet of God per se. I think it's like I said before, sort of a throne chariot, or Jesus describes it as a scepter, which he uses to shatter the earth. You don't live in the scepter, you use it as a tool. Same thing with the throne chariot. It's something you drive around in order to get from point A to point B and achieve an objective. Where actually God is not limited to any one particular place. He's a spirit who lives on a higher plane of existence. But it's possible he might have a contact point with the natural world on this planet. I don't know. In that sense, it is a quote-unquote throne, or a place where God interacts with the universe.
Is this also to be considered the hammer of God?
It could be considered. It's like a hammer or a mace. Mm-hmm. It's something God uses to judge the earth like a weapon.
So do you think that that's where mythology such as Thor and Thor's hammer, do you think it goes back to that, or do you think that's a whole other issue?
I don't know. I don't try to speculate too much about non-ancient Eastern mythology because it's pretty far removed, but it's possible that Nordic mythology might have been influenced.
Now, you get into a lot of that stuff, and just kind of shifting gears here a little bit. Well, first of all, before we shift gears, where can people get a hold of you, contact you, get a hold of your book?
Well, the book is available on Amazon.com. I think it's on BarnesandNoble.com. It's currently out of stock in print, but you can get the Kindle ebook. If you don't have a Kindle reader, you can download a reader program for any of your iPhones or iPads or your regular computer, so you can read a Kindle book on any device you have, including your regular laptop or desktop computer. You can also get it directly from survivormall.com. There's a link to survivormall.com's Planet X page on my website, which is planet-x.info. That's planet-x.info. There's links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and also survivormall.com, where you can buy Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man, and The End of the Age.
Now,
and you can also send me an email at publisher@mysteriousworld.com.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to shift gears. We got about 7 minutes left. What is mysteriousworld.com all about? Mysterious World is
actually a travel guide to exotic travel destinations around the world. I originally wanted to do a site on mysterious travel destinations, so like traveling around to various archaeological and mythological places. It's just more of a personal interest of mine. So I started documenting these travels and writing articles about background for them to see if I could turn it into a viable commercial enterprise. But I found more and more that when I wrote about Christian stuff, it was much more popular than travel articles. So Mysterious World has been gradually morphing into more of a, when I was publishing it, that's been published for several years, into more of a site about ancient mysteries of the Bible. In fact, the articles in the Giants which you posted in Facebook are by far the most popular articles on the site. In fact, one of those articles, all four of those articles draw more traffic than all the rest of the site combined. It's a really big difference. And so those articles on the Giants have been proven to be fairly influential and helped start me on the circuit of various talk shows years ago. I also wrote a book called Mysterious World Ireland, which talks about, which also includes a section on Christianity in Ireland, Irish mythology, and the Giants of Ireland. So that's fairly popular to people who like Irish mythology as well. And then my upcoming book will be a book about giants, published also through Defender Press, probably this year. And that'll talk about not only the giants, but the fall of Lucifer, and my theory about how the universe was created.
Mm. What do you think do you think the giants are going to play a role in the last days?
Yes, they will most likely appear in some form. As at the peak of the tribulation period, the giants that are probably being bred and trained as we speak will be unleashed upon the earth to conquer and control it. That is one of the ways that the Antichrist will conquer the world is through the use of the special forces that he is creating genetically, and probably hidden underground bases waiting to be unleashed, like the Uruk-hai of Sauron's. Saruman actually bred the Uruk-hai in underground bases waiting to be unleashed upon on Rohan. Similar concepts.
Like, what did Tolkien know? Because, man, I mean, it does seem like he was really tapped in and seemed to understand that more than anybody, his time period anyway.
I actually wrote a series, an article on Tolkien on mysteriousworld.com, which your readers might find interesting, and some of his influences and background. And he was very much into the same kind of stuff I'm talking about now. And I think what he did is he basically summarized the entirety of the major points that he discovered during his research as in the form of a cipher, which we call the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
That it enciphered major important points about the history of mankind and very important secrets, which I'm in the process of unraveling. One of the most important, second only to Planet X itself, is the mysterious object known as the Tsohar, which will reappear in the end times as the abomination of desolation. It will be placed on the peak of the temple and used as a weapon of great destruction against those who oppose the Antichrist's rule. This was manifest in The Lord of the Rings as the great eye of Sauron on top of a tower. So in a similar fashion, the Tsohar will appear like a great red eye on the top of a tower in the end times.
Really? So his whole two towers idea with the eye on top of it,
yes.
This is a cipher for something he discovered in his research?
It's made of three primary components. The Fellowship of the Ring represents a gold ring which surrounds this eye, which is basically a sapphire stone about a cubit in diameter and lens shaped. The two towers represents two upright poles on either side of it, which hold it in place. And the Return of the King refers specifically to its aspect as sort of a palantir kind of object. In the Return of the King, the major scene at the beginning is Aragorn holding up this palantir, and the great red eye of Sauron appears in it. That's how it'll actually look. So the king is actually Jesus, and the palantir is representative of Satan's, Lucifer specifically. My theory is that Lucifer is not actually a spirit, but actually a supercomputer that went rogue. And Satan is a spirit that inhabited that supercomputer. Sort of like Lucifer is the machine, and Satan is the ghost of the machine. And this supercomputer will be found in the end times, this Sohar stone, and it'll be used for great destruction.
Wow, you just like opened up a huge can of worms at 2 minutes before the end of the broadcast.
Don't you love it? Don't you love it?
I'm thinking, well, that's a great setup for a part 2.
That's what the major theme of the book on the Giants will be. The MacGuffin, if you will.
The MacGuffin, yes. Alfred Hitchcock, right?
That name also has hidden meaning as well.
Does it?
Yes.
Wow, that's fascinating. So is there anything out on the web that we can read now, or we got to wait for the book?
Sorry, you got to wait.
And when do you think that'll be?
Probably by the fall. I'm going to rejoice as a strong man to run a race to get it done. I'm finally ready to finish it.
And you're going to publish that through Defender?
Yes, we're already set up. Poor Tom's been waiting literally years for it. I'm gonna have to write an extra good book as an apology.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna have to. Well, certainly, please contact me on Facebook or email or whatever when you're done with that, because I'm fascinated by that. I enjoy C.S. Lewis's stuff, but man, it seemed like Tolkien just really understood. And his is so multifaceted and layered. Mm-hmm. I don't even begin to understand it all. I mean, I can certainly pick out the allegories here and there, but I'm very intrigued by what you may be.
I have one other book, a Kindle book called The Riddle of the Sphinx, available on Amazon, which will talk about how the Sohar, I believe, is actually this sapphire stone supercomputer is actually hidden under the Sphinx and will be found by the Antichrist in the end times.
And that's, I know that's available. I've seen those articles on mysterioustalworld.com. And well, we got 20 seconds left. So, hey, Doug, man, thanks so much for coming on tonight. And again, I'd love to have you on again. Talk about this some more on the Revolutionary Radio Project. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening.